Jesus provided warnings for his disciples by means of 3 parables. First, he gave the parable of the virgins, then the parable of the talents, and finally, the parable of the sheep and the goats. The discreet virgins were wise, and they showed this by being ready when the bridegroom arrived in the middle of the night. They had lamps to light their way. And Matthew 25, verse 4 adds that the discreet virgins took oil in their flasks along with their lamps, so they had the means to keep their lamps burning. Because they proved to be ready, they could follow the bridegroom into his marriage feast. But what about the foolish virgins? Well, unlike the discreet virgins, the foolish ones were not ready when the bridegroom arrived. Their lamps died out. As a result, they could not follow the bridegroom and enter into his marriage feast. When they later tried to do so, they heard the bridegroom tell them, "I do not know you." What is the lesson and warning that Jesus was illustrating? He was showing that only anointed Christians who keep on the watch and prove to be ready will follow him into the reward. Notice, though, that Jesus did not say that there would be a large number of foolish ones who would be unprepared when he comes in this way at the Great Tribulation. Here, too, this is a warning, not a prophecy. We're not focused on 5 of them being discreet and 5 of them being foolish. Jesus was simply letting anointed ones know what would happen if they failed to keep on the watch. That is a sobering thought. Whether our hope is heavenly or earthly, all true Christians should listen to the warning found in the parable of the virgins. We must keep on the watch and always be ready to carry out our service to God. In this parable, Jesus tells about 2 slaves who were faithful to their master and 1 slave who was not. How did the 2 slaves prove to be faithful? Well, the faithful slaves worked hard to increase the money that their master entrusted to their care just before he traveled abroad. When he returned, the faithful slaves had more to give back than what they had received, and they were blessed for doing so. But what about the 3rd slave, the sluggish one? What did he do with what he had received? Well, the sluggish slave buried what he had been given and failed to increase his master's talents. When the master returned, that slave had nothing additional to give to his master. He even tried to blame the master, calling him a demanding man. As a result, that slave did not receive greater blessings. More than that, what he had been given was taken away from him, and he was cast out of the master's household. What did the master's response mean for each of his slaves, and whom do they picture today? The 2 faithful slaves depict anointed Christians who prove to be valued members of the master's household. The master, Jesus, invites them to enter into the joy of their master. That joy pictures their heavenly reward. On the other hand, the bad example of the sluggish slave provides a warning for anointed ones. How so? If anointed ones do not remain alert and watchful, they could become self-satisfied with what they have received. They might not extend themselves in kingdom service. They could lose sight of their responsibilities and fail to do as 2 Peter 1 verse 10 urges, where they are told to make the calling and choosing sure for themselves. If any of them become like the sluggish slave, they would not be approved to enter into the heavenly kingdom and share in the joy of the master. Once again, Jesus was providing a warning, not a prophecy. Clearly, all anointed Christians must strive to be both discreet and faithful. Whether our hope is heavenly or earthly, all true Christians are determined to remain faithful to Jehovah. It's noteworthy that just before relating his parables, Jesus spoke about a faithful and discreet slave who would distribute spiritual food at the proper time during the last days. That slave pictures a small group of anointed Christian men today, the governing body. For their faithful service, Jesus said that there would be a reward, but he also provided a warning. He spoke about what would happen if that slave ever lost sight of Jesus' future return and started to mistreat his fellow slaves. If that were to happen, that slave would be viewed as evil and would, as Matthew 24:51 states, be punished with the greatest severity. Please note that Jesus was not prophesying that there would be an evil slave. This is a warning, not a prophecy. Now, with that in mind, let's consider Matthew chapter 24 and verses 40 and 41. And as we do, we'll see how these verses connect to Jesus' parables for the anointed. Matthew 24, verse 40, it reads, "Then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken along and the other abandoned. 2 women will be grinding at the handmill. One will be taken along and the other abandoned." Did you notice some similarities to the parables? Jesus spoke of 2 men working in a field and of 2 women working at a handmill. Outwardly, they appear to be the same. But in each case, Jesus said that one would be taken along and the other abandoned. He then urged his followers to keep on the watch, therefore, because you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Jesus said something very similar after relating the parable of the virgins. In both examples, he provided a warning.
Did you notice anything odd in this interpretation of Jesus' illustrations? In Matthew 24, 40, and 41, it was said that this was not to be understood as being a prophecy, but to be viewed as a warning to all Christians. In verses 45 through 47, in the illustration of the faithful and discreet slave, it was said that Jesus was prophesying that he would appoint a small group of men to serve as a governing body. However, verses 48 through 50, one of the same illustration, are not to be understood as a prophecy, but as a warning to that governing body. In Matthew 25, 1 through 13, the very next illustration, the 10 virgins, is said to be not a prophecy, but a warning, primarily to the anointed, but by extension to all Christians. Verses 14 through 30, the illustration of the talents, is also said to be a warning, not a prophecy. Where does Jesus tell us which illustration or which part of an illustration is prophetic, and which is simply a warning? How are we to know that the illustration of the faithful and discreet slave is not to be viewed in the same way as the 10 virgins, the talents and the workers that were either taken along or abandoned? Were they not all simply lessons with the aim of warning the disciples to keep awake? How would Jesus' disciples understand his illustration of the faithful and discreet slave? If it is true that Jesus was speaking about a group of men that he would appoint 2,000 years in the future, how would they know that? Who are the only ones that stand to benefit from this being a prophecy about Jesus appointing a group of men to serve as his channel? Doesn't it seem odd that Jesus would give his disciples 4 illustrations showing the importance for each one of them individually to keep awake, and yet not utter one word about the need for them to follow the lead of, to trust completely and obey the faithful and discreet slave? It should be noteworthy that the very first thing Jesus says to his disciples in answer to their question about the conclusion of the system of things in Matthew chapter 24 is,
"Look out that nobody misleads you, for many will come on the basis of my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many."
So, will you heed the warning